Hi, my name is Elise Stevenson, and I will be introducing this presentation over the history of the Chinese Exclusion Act. The Chinese Exclusion Act was a law instituted in 1882 which halted Chinese laborer immigration and denied the Chinese from becoming U.S. citizens for 10 years. Yet this act, along with immense discrimination and violence, persisted long after those 10 years. This was the first Exclusion Act geared towards an entire ethnic group. This section of history is largely forgotten by Americans, yet it has so many existing repercussions. A University of Oklahoma Chinese professor explains that throughout her studies as a student in China, the Chinese Exclusion Act was not mentioned in history books and was discovered through her independent reading. Because of the Opium Wars of the mid-19th century, China was in deep debt. Along with this debt, there were many natural disasters in China, such as floods and droughts, that deprived Chinese farmers from their work. Around this time, in 1848, an enormous amount of gold was discovered in Sacramento Valley of California, and therefore caused the historical gold rush. Because of this striking opportunity, many Chinese men immigrated to the west coast of the United States in search of wealth to take back to their families in China. However, this journey for the fortune did not go as planned for the Chinese. In 1852, a foreign miners' tax aimed at the Chinese miners was implemented in California. 2 years later, in the People v. Hall case, the Supreme Court ruled that the Chinese, similar to other ethnic groups, could not testify in court. Therefore, no justice could be sought after by the immigrants. Shortly after this ruling, in 1858, California legally prohibits the Chinese and Mongolian immigration. Sadly, the treatment the Chinese immigrants endured in the United States only got worse.
This is the Taijitu. It's the symbolic representation of the relationship, the concept of opposing forces, with one being yin, the other being yang, but that just means sun and moon. So it's a philosophical construct that represents the idea that everything in the universe, everything in the cosmos, from the smallest thing to the largest thing, every object, every force exists as a balance of opposing forces. And each one, the little small dots, each one, so we'll say this is light and dark, each one contains within it the seeds of the other. And so let's say we're in the white period, but even during the white period, the seeds of black are there. And over time, they grow. They grow, they shrink, they grow, they shrink, but it's constantly changing. And at some point, eventually, the seeds will grow to the point that it turns white into black. So white is turned into its opposite. So now you have the flipping of the yin and yang. Yang becomes yin, yin becomes yang. And now we're in the black period, but the black contains the seeds of white that over time ebb and flow and eventually will grow and convert black back into white. So the best way I can think of describing U.S.-China relationships is exactly in this kind of dynamic.
Though short, the time period from 1860 to 1869 still had far-reaching effects on public sentiment leading up to the Naturalization Act of 1870. The 1862 Act to prohibit coolies was passed because the government thought that Chinese workers were being used as replacements for slaves, though they were actually mostly contracted workers. They were free, but this didn't stop the confusion from contributing to anti-Chinese immigration thought. At the same time, this act wasn't really enforced because it was hard to tell which workers would be defined as coolies. In 1865, Central Pacific began hiring Chinese workers because not enough white workers were willing to do the tough and pretty dangerous job of building the Transcontinental Railroad. The Burlingame-Seward Treaty of 1868 before it was revised, was one of the final measures the U.S. took to try and secure relations with China, before the anti-Chinese sentiment of the U.S. people grew too strong to ignore. The treaty promised unrestricted immigration for both countries. It also had the effect of making the discriminatory policies against the Chinese illegal, though the treaty's main goal was to ensure that American firms would be kept supplied with cheap labor, as well as maintaining a good trade relationship with China. The completion of the railroad in 1869 led to many Chinese entering the labor market, making it difficult for workers to find jobs. This significantly contributed to anti-Chinese sentiment.
The 1870s began with the Naturalization Act, which allowed African Americans to become naturalized citizens of the United States. However, this same law also barred Chinese immigrants from attaining citizenship, and it revoked the citizenship of Chinese Americans that had already attained it. In 1875, the Page Law was passed to bar the immigration of Chinese women that did not fit American moral standards. The drive for this law stemmed from a fear of Chinese prostitution corrupting white American men and boys. The means of determining which Chinese women were potential prostitutes and which would be allowed in were largely arbitrary. Officials in charge of the process often discriminated against applicants based upon their faith, their appearance in a photograph shipped ahead of them, which was required, by the way, and their marital history. In 1877, the San Francisco anti-Chinese riot saw over 10,000 unadjusted US dollars in property damage done to Chinese stores and homes, as well as 4 fatalities and an unknown number of injuries. This riot brought together the working men parties and other anti-Chinese labor groups that would form a coalition to successfully lobby for the Chinese Exclusion Act only a few years later. In 1877, the San Francisco anti-Chinese riot saw over 10,000 unadjusted US dollars in property damage done to Chinese stores and homes, as well as 4 fatalities and an unknown number of injuries. This riot brought together the working men parties and other anti-Chinese labor groups that would form a coalition to successfully lobby for the Chinese Exclusion Act only a few years later. In 1878, the Ninth Circuit Court of California ruled that Chinese Americans could not obtain citizenship because they were not white. Judge Lorenzo Sawyer based his ruling off of his understanding of prevailing scientific theories of race at the time and the assertion that members of the, quote, Mongolian race, unquote, were unsuited to Republican government. The combination of these laws, the court decision, and the riots of the time would embolden the anti-Chinese elements of the U.S. They would go on to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act only a few years later and incite future riots and massacres along the West Coast.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was signed into law on May 6th by President Chester A. Arthur. This act was the result of rising stigma against Chinese immigrants, namely from Western Americans who accused Chinese immigrants for declining jobs as well as fair wage. This was the first United States Immigration Act signed into law that banned a people group based solely on ethnicity. This act effectively banned Chinese immigration for a period of 10 years. It also disallowed any Chinese Americans from citizenship through naturalization. After the Exclusion Act expired, it was expanded for another 10 years by the Geary Act of 1892.
The United States and China signed a treaty that allows the U.S. to limit Chinese immigration in 1880. Since then, many Americans on the West Coast attributed declining wages and economic ills to Chinese workers. The Chinese Exclusion Act was officially passed by Congress in 1882, which was the first significant law restricting immigration into the U.S. Three years later, the Rock Springs Massacre happened in 1885 in Wyoming. The reason was white miners would film with the suspected that Chinese workers had depressed their wages. A brawl erupted between some white and Chinese miners. They even armed themselves with knives, guns, and other weapons. In all, 28 Chinese were killed, 15 wounded, and all 79 of the shacks and houses in Rock Springs, Chinatown, looted and burned. Hundreds more unofficially that mutilated bodies people burned alive, resulting in about $150,000 in property damage. In 1888, the Cross Act extended the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited Chinese laborers aboard or who planned future travels from returning. It declares over 20,000 Chinese laborers re-entry permits now and void, and denied re-entry.
In 1892, the United States passed the Geary Act. The Geary Act extended the Chinese Exclusion Act for another 10 years, but most notably required all Chinese residents to carry permits. If Chinese immigrants were found without their permits, they could be subject to deportation from the country. In 1893, the Supreme Court upheld the Chinese Exclusion Act in Fangyue Ting versus the United States. This allowed no Chinese person not already in the country into the country after this. The restrictions meant that many Chinese would be expelled from the nation. This also maintained the requirement that all Chinese laborers obtain their papers for proof of residence within 1 year, or they would face deportation. It acknowledged the opposition that this act would cause tension with China and could make Americans be forced out of China. In 1898, the U.S. Supreme Court admits Wong Kim Ark, a Chinese American born and raised in the United States, back into the United States. Ark was initially denied entry due to the Chinese Exclusion Act. The case rules that U.S.-born Chinese cannot be divested of their citizenship. This was a monumental win for the Chinese because it set the precedent that birthright citizenship does not exclude Chinese Americans.
The San Francisco earthquake of 1906 was a great tragedy that destroyed 80% of San Francisco and resulted in 3,000 casualties. This tragedy did present a reprieve to many Chinese Americans living in San Francisco at the time. The city hall was destroyed along with many of the citizenship records. This resulted in many Chinese immigrants claiming citizenship as all the records had been destroyed, and nobody could really prove otherwise. This began the paper son strategy, in which many Chinese sons overseas then immigrated to the United States in order to claim citizenship after their parents had been deceased. Stigma against Chinese immigrants, as well as the Chinese Exclusion Act, persisted until World War II. In 1941, the Japanese Empire attacked Pearl Harbor, which resulted in the United States declaring war on Japan. China, which was already at war with Japan at the time, immediately became allies with the United States. This dramatically altered the American perception of Chinese people. Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek and his wife, Madam Sung, began a propaganda campaign in the United States. These two Chinese leaders converted to Christianity, which resulted in many prominent American leaders and politicians beginning to hope for a Christian democratic China.
So now American propaganda swings full tilt behind China. So China is now our ally. China is now our friend. We began allowing Chinese, even before the war, we began to allow some Chinese to come to the U.S. to go to school. So we opened up the education system. So Chinese began to study at American universities. So this was the beginning of the end of the Exclusion Act. But it was primarily for educational purposes. And then when World War I started, basically they were repealed.